My name is Sharon Bong. I'm an associate professor in gender and religious studies at Monash University, Malaysia, and I'm honored to be part of this global project in contextualizing the Pope's latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. I've been invited to reflect on chapter 3, which is Envisaging and Engendering an Open World. To address the chapter's radical potentiality, I begin by outlining the Malaysian government's recent deportation of 1,086 migrants and refugees. I then interpret the state's action in the time of coronavirus in terms of Foucault's biopower that characterizes modern states' power over life of its citizens and strangers. I then move on to critiquing the state's action in light of the message of the encyclical. Is the Pope's exhortation of a universal love that promotes persons naive in the ways of the world among sovereign nation states? Or could an ethos of universal love for one's neighbor be the radical hope that enables us to recognize and embrace the stranger within ourselves? Reflecting on the encyclical is timely, as it was written in the time of coronavirus, which we are all surviving, as we witness how existing structures of inequality are made worse, especially for those who have little and who have lost a lot. This phenomenon is exemplified in Malaysia's management, mistreatment, culminating in the forced repatriation of migrant workers, refugees, and asylum seekers. The event that I'm highlighting happened on the 23rd of February 2021, when the state deported 1,086 undocumented migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers who are Myanmar nationals just a day before the first batch of Pfizer vaccines arrived. What many Malaysians, including myself, found shocking and repugnant is that the state acted in defiance of the High Court's order to stay the deportation of the original 1,200 persons. The state also acted inhumanely, as it is fully aware of the dangers that these deportees would face, as the military had overtaken the democratically elected government in Myanmar in that same month and continues to brutally crack down on the young protesters, which includes firing at them. The state's action is sadly consistent with the way it has carried out systemic marginalization of undocumented migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Documented migrant workers are tolerated as they handle the 3D jobs, dirty, demanding, and dangerous, that Malaysians refuse to take on. Attached to these kinds of jobs are the 3D stigmas, which are disease, depravity, and drugs. But the inhospitable state and some Malaysians are far less tolerant of undocumented migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. Initially, in terms of COVID-19 management, the state assured these communities that if they willingly came forward to be tested, they would not be arrested and deported. This seeming act of good faith earned the cooperation of the UN Refugee Agency in Malaysia that had issued 180,000 UN cards to refugees. However, crackdowns, arrests, and detentions soon followed. As Malaysia is not a signatory of the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, it does not hold itself accountable in setting up formal mechanisms that offer adequate protection to refugees and asylum seekers. The state's goodwill had been precarious and conditionally offered at best. The state forcibly repatriated the Myanmar nationals for the common good, as it viewed them only as illegal immigrants holding UN cards rather than as refugees. In order to better make sense of the state's dangerous deportations, I turn briefly to the idea of biopolitics, which is a concept that was first introduced by a French philosopher, the late Michel Foucault. Biopolitics is basically the state's exercise of biopower. Biopower is defined as a series of interventions and regulatory controls. This results in the state's invasive powers that are designed to regulate one's sexual and reproductive health and rights from womb to tomb, that is, lifelong. The state intervenes in the name of optimizing one's contribution not only to the reproduction of the species body or citizens, but also the production of labor to sustain the nation's growth and wealth. Control of the population and containment of disease further involves shutting out bodies that are deemed a threat to the well-being of the primary species body. In the context of modern states that confer or deny citizenship status, species body refers to those with more than a UN card. Racism, therefore, factors in the exercise of biopower. The racialization of biopower, when analyzed from a gendered lens, becomes the basis of sexism, where men are privileged over women, with women's bodies and sexualities more regulated. Biopower is also the basis of heterosexism, which privileges heterosexuality as the norm and marginalizes non-heteronormative or LGBT sexualities as deviant, as they are not reproductive. When we apply biopower, we understand why and how migrant workers, refugees, and asylum seekers, especially women and children, are not only differently, but also more disproportionately impacted by extraordinary hardships in the time of coronavirus. We then realize that the state's deportation of these persons is tantamount to assisted genocide. And when we say or do nothing, we are also complicit. The state spared 114 due to pressure from local human rights organizations such as Amnesty International Malaysia and their global allies. The fate of these 114 remain uncertain, as the UN Refugee Agency in Malaysia has unconscionably been denied access to refugees and asylum seekers since August of 2019. The main takeaway of Fratelli Tutti, across its 8 chapters and 287 paragraphs, is not new. It exalts the Christian ethos of loving thy neighbor as thyself, exemplified in the parable of the Good Samaritan. The irony about our world and how we manage human relations is that the more we are brought closer by communication technologies and shared goals, the more we are also torn apart by divisions and differences among ourselves. We can surely do better. When we try to understand the state's deportation of those fleeing persecution from their own homes through the lens of Fratelli Tutti, new insights emerge. We are firstly called to uphold a sacred duty of hospitality, as we are made for love based on a law of ecstasies. This commandment to love requires us to move beyond ourselves in openness to others, to attend to their needs, build their capacities, and heal their wounds. The Catholic Bishops' Conference of Malaysia, in drawing on Fratelli Tutti, issued a media statement that opposed the state's deportation of Myanmar refugees. In a spirit of fraternal love, it says, the Church cannot turn a blind eye to those in need and the vulnerable, irrespective of who they are and where they come from. Committed Malaysians were called to move beyond individualistic Lenten practices towards cultivating a love and compassion for one another that excludes no one and is open to all, where no one is left behind. Leaving no one behind is an example of a global goal, as this is the vision of the Sustainable Development Goals. Concerned citizens across multi-ethnic and religious lines on social media who professed their solidarity with these deported persons and vented their shame at the state's reprehensible actions approximate the gift of hospitality, particularly critical in a time of crisis. In doing so, ordinary Malaysians promote the moral good, the value of solidarity, which nurtures a solidity that is born of the consciousness that we are responsible for the fragility of others as we strive to build a common future. It is to not harden our hearts at those who embody vulnerability. We are secondly called to recognize not only the complementarity of rights-based and faith-based visions, but also the greater potentiality of faith-based visions in radicalizing the ways in which humans relate to each other. Fratelli Tutti states that every human being has the right to live with dignity and to develop integrally. This resonates with fundamental principles of human rights and international law that affirm refugees' rights to migrate, their right to seek and enjoy asylum, and their right to be free of torture. In particular, the principle of non-refoulement entails positive obligations that oblige the state to find out about the treatment to which the applicants would be exposed after their return, even though it has not ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol. Therefore, the state's defiance of not only its own High Court's stay of deportation order, but also the principle of non-refoulement of international law, shows us that the rule of law and secular orders have a limited obligation on the state. In this regard, Fratelli Tutti challenges the universality of rights as applicable to all, at all times, and at all places. The state's reasoning of putting its citizens first also exposes the continuum of violence that not only makes foreigners strangers in Malaysia, but also discriminates some of its own citizens. Fratelli Tutti calls these persons hidden exiles. And in Malaysia, these lesser citizens are women and the LGBT community who suffer the systemic, often state-driven sexual and gender-based discrimination and violence. Thirdly, Fratelli Tutti offers radical hope in engendering a heaven on earth in the here and now. This is a vision of a socialist utopia that revisions the social role of property. Fratelli Tutti delinks the integrity of the person to what they possess, which in some cultures still includes the possession of women, children, and slaves. Fratelli Tutti also deterritorializes national borders by envisioning that each country also belongs to the foreigner. Adapting this as a universal commitment to love would revolutionize the ethics of international relations that are largely framed by transactional relations, for instance, the exchange of goods, knowledge, even COVID-19 vaccines, that culminate in third world debts that cannot be repaid. Universalizing the ethos of love would revert the state's response to pandemics like COVID-19, to not further torment the least, the last, and the lost, but to welcome them literally into our homes. It is essentially to recognize that every human being possesses an inalienable dignity. It seems like an impossible goal, but it need not be. May we learn not to bully those fleeing from persecution, not to ravage the weak in our homes, and not to blame minorities for our misfortunes. Fratelli Tutti challenges us to rise to this new humanity where our past, present, and future are inextricably linked. It celebrates humanity's diversity by insisting that our future is not monochrome. It inspires us to dismantle structures of violence that divide, dispossess, and disenfranchise the weak. I end this reflection with the last words of chapter 3 from Pope Francis's address on nuclear weapons. Delivered at the atomic bomb hypocenter park in Nagasaki, Pope Francis says, "A real and lasting peace will only be possible on the basis of a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation in the service of a future shaped by interdependence and shared responsibility in the whole human family. Peace to all."